This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. What I'm looking at today is 1983's Krull, directed by Peter Yates. Krull is a movie that I really enjoyed growing up. Everything about it was interesting. The acting, the special effects, the story. It was all very well done. And never mind, it had the glaive. The glaive was awesome. It was so cool. That being said, looking at Krull with somewhat wiser eyes, I've come to the conclusion that while it's still enjoyable, and it's still a movie that I like to watch, it is not exactly a good movie, and I'll go into why in a moment. Krull revolves around a planet named Krull, and two kingdoms on the planet are trying to come together to forge an alliance against the coming of the Black Fortress and the Beast and its minions called Slayers. This is a very interesting aspect of the movie for me, and it feels very science fiction-y because apparently the Black Fortress travels through space from planet to planet, which is very much a science fiction type scenario. Though Krull changes into a more fantasy-driven story as we meet the two kingdoms that are coming together, and we come to understand a little bit more about this culture. Now, to be fair, Krull never explains how the Black Fortress is able to do what it does. There are no engines, it just does it, which implies strongly magic. But once again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very science fiction-esque type of trope. And so it is initially confusing. As a younger person, I just went with it. As an older person, I'm a little more circumspect. So therefore, I'm looking at it and wondering why this is happening. It doesn't quite make sense. Though, as I said, while initially beginning as more science fiction based, Krull very quickly changes to a fantasy, which is fine in and of itself, but I wish that the movie were more forthright in telling the viewer what they were looking at. And another thing that the movie doesn't make particularly clear is that Krull is an alien world. The inhabitants look like humans, but they are not humans. They have a tolerance for heat, for instance, which is way beyond anything a normal human would have. So these are aliens. Krull is an alien planet. The entire movie takes place in this science fiction space. But once again, Krull is not a science fiction movie. And this is one of the many problems of Krull. It's trying to be too much. Initially, it's a science fiction film. It changes to a fantasy film. It needs to be one or the other because it's trying to do two things and it's not doing either of them, at least initially, particularly well. And so, in an effort to combine their forces against those of the Beast, there's a marriage plan between Prince Corwin, played by Ken Marshall, and Princess Lissa, played by Lysette Anthony. One of the problems with Krull is that there's not a very good sense of time. The movie initially begins with the landing of the Black Fortress of the Beast upon the planet of Krull. And almost immediately it feels like the Beast and its Slayers are conquering Krull, and the alliance between the two kingdoms comes together, or attempts to come together, to fight the Beast. The problem with this is that I get the feeling that this process took weeks, if not months, to actually happen. But the way the movie is cut, edited, feels as if it happens immediately. And that doesn't really make any sense from a narrative standpoint. So the Slayers crash this meeting between these two kingdoms, slaying everyone but Prince Corwin and Princess Lissa. Now the thing of it is, the Slayers do think they've killed Prince Corwin, though they made a mistake. They kidnap Princess Lissa, and the rest of the movie revolves around Corwin trying to gather support, gather allies to rescue Princess Lissa from the beast. And part of his strategy to do so is to recover the glaive, which is a mythical weapon that was lost to time, though it is a very real weapon. Though the movie reveals that the glaive wasn't quite as necessary as it might have appeared, which is a really odd sentiment because about a third of the film revolves around retrieving the glaive. And to have it be essentially not so important, the real secret is love, kind of undermines everything that came before and made the sacrifices to achieve things like the glaive kind of pointless. One of the biggest problems with Krull is that it leans too heavy into its fantasy elements, despite initially beginning life as a fantasy movie. And the thing about fantasy as opposed to science fiction is that you don't typically have to explain why anything happens, because it's magic. You're done as far as your explanations go. But the thing of it is, as I mentioned, Krull does not begin like that. And science fiction tends to require explaining. Now let's be honest, a lot of the explanation for what happens in science fiction can be nonsense, like, I don't know, Star Trek and the warp drive, utter nonsense. But within that world, there's a logic to it and it makes sense. Krull never gives you that satisfaction of understanding why anything is happening, whether they're uncanny or not. How does the Black Fortress go through space? Magic, apparently. How does it transport every night from one location in Krull to another? Magic, apparently. This is lazy writing more than anything else. And it undermines the film in some really kind of interesting ways, to be totally honest, but undermines it nonetheless. And since we're wondering about things, why does the beast go from planet to planet like a plague of space locusts? Based on the movie, it's conquering these planets for reasons? What would have been clever would have perhaps been that the beast is conquering planets to provide troops for its army. In other words, the Slayers would have been people that the beast and its Black Fortress had encountered prior. That would have been interesting. But once again, we're giving no explanation. The beast just does things. It's almost like a force of nature. Though, as I'll go into a little later, the beast kind of sucks. And I don't mean his motivations for things. Just in terms of his power set and just being a world-conquering entity, he kind of sucks and is a little lame. Now the thing of it is, the Slayers look to me like whomever designed them had recently seen Alien, because they look like knockoff aliens. Beyond that, they don't make a lot of sense. For instance, they have staffs which will fire a single bolt, and they can turn them around and use them as a spear. The problem with this is that, why have a staff that can fire one bolt? Why not two bolts? It's the same issue with the interceptors from Jerry Anderson's UFO. Why have one missile? We could have, I don't know, 10 missiles. Maybe slightly less powerful, but 10 missiles nonetheless. It doesn't make any sense to me why this would be the case. And also, the Slayers are somewhat slow and awkward. The idea that they could conquer the combined forces of two kingdoms, I assume, because once again, we're not given much information about either, is kind of laughable because they're not very good fighters. Initially, we see them slaughter all these soldiers that have come together to fight the threat of the beast. Yet, smaller groups of men do really well against Slayers in greater number. That might have something to do with the Slayers being kind of slow and awkward. Once again, doesn't make sense. Even under the fairy tale logic, if you want to apply it to this movie, doesn't quite make sense. The Slayers should be either faster or slower with greater numbers. That way, at least their relatively mediocre fighting abilities augmented by sheer numbers. To be as slow as they appear to be, that they can win battles with much quicker moving people, even people without any kind of blaster type weapon, doesn't really make any sense. And speaking of Alien, apparently the Slayers are piloted by a parasite that's in their heads. We notice because in certain battles the Slayer is slain. The Slayer is slain, that's interesting. Well, the Slayer is killed and something comes from its head and dives through the floor. It goes out saying that the movie gives us no explanation as to what just happened. Though, once again, it seems to me to point to the admiration that the production had for Ridley Scott's Alien, because it feels very Alien adjacent. Once again, we have to go back to the idea that Alien is a science fiction film, and so it provided logical explanations for what was happening. Krull, while initially appearing science fiction, is more of a fantasy, which is to say, shit just happens with seemingly no explanation. While Prince Colwyn is trying to find a glaive, happening concurrently is that the Beast is trying to woo Princess Lissa. And now I'm even more confused by this movie, because why is this happening? What is the point of this happening? Now, Lysette Anthony is an attractive woman, but is she that attractive? I think not. The Beast trying to woo her doesn't make any sense, because first off, he's something like, I don't know, 15 or 20 feet tall. Second off, why is he doing it? That this world-conquering monster from space has fallen in love with her? That's what it seems to be saying. And if it is, it's ridiculous. It is nonsensical. And I was trying to understand why this would be happening. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, the Beast did fall in love with her. To what end? It's not like he needs her armies, because he's just slaughtered them. Nothing about it makes sense. And it's the director, it's the writers, relying on a lazy idea of fantasy. Just throw any shit they can against the wall to see if it sticks. It is nonsense. And it doesn't make sense within the context of the movie. And speaking of the Beast, he is so weak. He is the leader, the lord, I don't know, of the Slayers. And he commands this black fortress, this thing that is able to travel through space and transport anywhere it wants on this planet. Yet when Colwyn finally faces him with the glaive, the Beast just has these fireballs it throws from its mouth. That's it. And the thing of it is, Prince Colwyn can even stand against the firebolts, sans glaive. One hits him, he's aware it happens, but it doesn't like virtually destroy him. He just kind of shrugs and continues throwing the glaive at it. How is this creature the leader of the Slayers? Once again, it makes no sense. If the Beast were depicted as more powerful and more deadly, it would immediately put everything in a particular context, a very logical context, which is to say, you could understand how he did what he did and why he, not necessarily why he did it, but how he did what he did, how he commanded the legions of Slayers that he commanded, and so on and so forth. Instead, we encounter a creature that seems so, relatively speaking, weak when in combat with Prince Colwyn, that how it is doing anything that it is doing, once again, makes no sense. And I have to repeat, I love this movie. This movie is awesome. But I saw this movie at a point in my life where I was open to it, no matter how silly some of what it was saying actually was. I mentioned earlier that Krull doesn't quite know what it wants to be, and that it starts off as science fiction, veers sharply into fantasy, and not very well. And a prime example of this is the scene of the fire mirrors. The fire mares are these mythical type horses that are able to travel thousands of leagues in a single night. They're important because I mentioned earlier that the Black Fortress can appear in different areas of Krull. Well, it's going to appear next in the Iron Desert, I believe. And Colwyn and his band have to reach it before it transports once again. Now, the fire mares are supposedly so fast, yet they're not fast enough to evade being captured by men. Now keep in mind something, these are once again wild horses, or at least the impression that the story gives is that we're talking about wild horses. They don't exactly seek to be rode. In fact, they're kind of not into it at all. So the idea that these 10, 11 men, however many there were able to ride these fire mares however long they needed to ride them is nonsense. It's bullshit. It's irritating, and it shouldn't have happened. Or if it were to happen, the story at least had to bring an element of logic to it, which is to say, the fire mares are so fast. So therefore, the story has to explain how they were captured and ridden. Once again, Krull does not care. It does not even try. It just does things. As a young person, I was there for it. It worked for me, but it really doesn't make any sense. Another interesting thing about Krull is that it's essentially the same movie as 1980's Hawk the Slayer, down to the quest engine of the entire movie, but with a larger budget. And speaking of Hawk the Slayer, the soundtracks play a significant role in both movies. Though, in the case of Krull, it's soundtracked by James Horner, the same person who scored Something Wicked This Way Comes, after the original score was removed. The soundtrack is so overbearing. I don't tend to enjoy movies where the music is telling me how to feel in a blatantly obvious way. And by my reckoning, that's the case with Krull. The music is just so obnoxious and overbearing. And that's not to say it's not good and well conducted, well played, and so on and so forth. It's very well done, but it's how it's used is the issue. And it is just obnoxious, as opposed to letting events on screen dictate how you would respond to them. It tells you how you should feel. It is an obnoxious soundtrack. It's not bad, it's interesting. It's just a little too manipulative for my taste. Though by my reckoning, the greatest difference between the two films, Hawk the Slayer and Krull, is that Krull has a significantly larger budget. From the widow and the web scenes to the model effects of the Black Fortress itself, it looks great. And it's so awesome to see actual models and stop motion animation. And if you've seen Hawk the Slayer, let's just say that they couldn't quite manage it. As I said before, I like Krull. I think it's an awesome movie. But a lot of what drives me to like certain films depends on when I saw them and at what point in my life I saw them. And I saw Krull at a point where I was hungry for this type of stuff. So it works for me. Is it a good movie though? Not really. It's got a lot of issues. But if you're able to look beyond them, you'll have a good time. The What Do You Think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. What I'm looking at today is 1983's. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow.